Day 3 of the Cairns Cup saw just one decisive game as we continue to have several players tied for first place after the initial 3 rounds. Jumping into the day's results, the former women's world champion Alexandra Kosteniuk bounced back from her loss yesterday to deliver the sole win of the round, defeating Dzagnidze with the white pieces. The rest of the games were drawn, as now Harika, Mariya Muzychuk, Zhongyi, and Kosteniuk all lead with 2 out of 3 points. Going into today's games, we'll start with the battle between the two former world champions and Mariya Muzychuk against Zhongyi. And in this one, Tan goes for the win over French, which seems to have come as a surprise for Muzychuk, as she spent 15 minutes here deciding what to do. Ends up playing knight ge2, which is kind of a sideline in this position. The main move, of course, is e5. After knight e2, black took on e4, a3. Tan, by the way, playing rather quickly here because this line is rather well known. Knight c6, and now white goes d5. So eventually white does win back the pawn here with queen takes e4, and white does get the bishop pair in this position, but black is way ahead in development. Rook e8 is coming, and ultimately black is doing quite fine. So bishop d3, knight e5, bishop e2. We get quite a dance of the pieces here as black looks to get compensation for the bishop pair. Bishop to g4, f3, trades on d2, king takes, rook check, bishop d3, and now bishop f5. Finally, black is going to be able to trade off white's bishop pair, and the 2 rooks in the center give black an equal game. White did manage to snag this pawn on c7, but now rook d7, the bishop drops back, black doubles up on the d file, takes, and black could take this pawn on d3 here with check and equalize the material after king to c2. I think white is a tiny bit better here because the bishop is definitely stronger than black's knight. But instead, black just plays for compensation, knight h5. I think this is a very, very reasonable decision. Taking the bishop, now knight to d4 check. And black is still a pawn down here, but it's very, very hard for white to do anything with this weakness on d3. So king to c2, knight d4 check. And the players actually soon repeated moves. Next up, we've got the game between Alice Lee against Harika Dronavalli. This one was a Slav, knight f3, knight f6, and now e3. This is known as the slow Slav variation. Bishop to g4, h3. This is fairly well-known theory. White goes g4, knight e5, going after the bishop pair in this game as well. Knight d7, h4, takes on c4. At this point, both players were playing their moves rather quickly here, as white gets the bishop pair, but does have to kind of advance on the king side and create some weaknesses in her position. So knight b6 now, bishop f1, bishop b4, bishop d2, and e5, Harika striking in the center. At this point, both players have started spending time. Alice with a long think on this move with queen to g4. Queen e7, a3, takes on d4. At this moment, Alice maybe could have gotten an advantage with the move a takes b4, taking the dark squared bishop. Now if black takes on c3, then b takes c3. This position seems to be a tiny bit better for white, although, of course, very, very complicated with the 2 bishops against the 2 knights. Knight takes b4 is also a possibility here, looking for knight c2 check. Then white would have to play rook c1, for example, takes on c3, bishop takes c3. And yeah, the engine's like white here, but of course it looks very, very complicated at first glance. So instead we saw queen takes d4, bishop c3, bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, and now queen takes g7, snagging a pawn because the rook on h8 is hanging. Black castles here, queen takes c3, and now queen to e4. And black is down a pawn, but with some very clear compensation. White's king is in the center, and black is, of course, completely mobilized. Rook h3 was played, rook he8, and now bishop to e2, queen to g2, bishop f1. Here the players repeat as well, and they soon agree to a draw after repeating the position 3 times. Technically, white maybe could have played on here with the move rook to c1, as suggested by Stockfish, but very, very hard to play this position as white. Even though white is a pawn up, the king is in the center, the rooks are disconnected. And yeah, it seems like black has all the practical chances in the world. So definitely draw seems like a fair result for this one as well. Moving on, we've got the battle of the Annas, Anna Zatonskih against Anna Muzychuk. And in this one, Zatonskih goes for the early knight c3 and bishop f4. This is known as the Jobava London system. But black reacted here quite solidly. c5, takes, bishop to g4. provoking the move f3, and now bishop back to d7. Very important move for black here to make sure that knight to b5 doesn't create any huge problems. Knight b5 was played anyway, but here black can take on b5 and just develop a knight c6. And although white has won the bishop pair here, black's position is very, very solid, and bishop to d6 just offers a trade of bishops. Hard for white to avoid this one. And ultimately, black was doing completely fine in this game. What we ended up getting was a6, bishop d3, trades on f4, queen to d6. This is kind of a classic structure. You can get this one from the Caro-Kann. It also looks like a reverse Carlsbad structure, queen's gambit declined. And yeah, both players here playing very, very solidly. White maneuvering the knight to e5, queen to f4. And at this point, Zatonskih maybe gets a bit of an initiative as she starts playing on the king side here. Queen to g5, bishop to d3, h4. But it seems like black's counterplay came in just in time here. So knight a4, rook e2, knight c5, bishop drops back, and now knight to d7. And at this point, white plays bishop to d3, likely with the idea to stop rook to c4, which would allow black to start trading pieces. Knight to c5, the knight returned, bishop to c2, and the players repeated in this position as well. So we had multiple repetitions in today's round. Of course, every game was very, very tense, but sometimes the action does break this way. White could have maybe considered playing on here with a move like h5. Then black would probably do something like rook to c4, and let's say, for example, f4. And this would be very, very complicated as black is going to get counterplay on the c file. In the meantime, white is looking to create some attack on the king side. So this would be very, very double-edged. The engines just call it completely equal. And yeah, understandable that both players decided not to risk it at this point. Next up, we got the game between Irina Krush and Elisabeth Paehtz. This one also started off with d4, and we get a Nimzo-Indian. E3 variation, very, very classic. B6, bishop d3, knight f3, knight e4. And this line, we get just a very, very thematic structure for the Nimzo-Indian, where black gives up the bishop pair on c3. Many, many games in today's round actually featured this imbalance with the bishop pair against the better structure. Here, castles, knight to d2, queen to h4. Black's position, of course, is all about this powerful bishop on b7, supporting the e4 square. So white goes f3, trades on d2, d6, and now d5. And this is likely a mistake from Krush, is after knight a6, black is actually not worried about d takes e6 at all. Black can pick up this pawn at any time, and white's pawns definitely start to look weaker and weaker. So instead, white had a lot of moves here. Rook a1, for example, I think keeps the position about balanced. Maybe white is a tiny bit better. But yeah, here after d5, it's actually black that seizes the initiative, takes queen f6, and Paehtz plays this one really nicely here after e7. Just rook f7, very calm move, keeping the f-pawn defended and allowing black to pick up this e-pawn later on without losing the f-pawn, of course. So now e4, white tries to create some counterplay in the meantime, but knight to c5, and black is in time to take the light squared bishop. Queen takes f5 here, and at this point, black has won the pawn back. Material has equalized, but black definitely has a very clear advantage with the opposite color bishops having the better bishop and definitely the better structure. So at this point, the players do go into an endgame, and Paehtz starts pushing this one for quite some time. Black definitely has the advantage here, but it's not quite winning yet, so it would require white to make some kind of mistake in order to actually win this one. But black keeps pushing here for many, many moves. I'll remind you folks, the time control for the event is game in 2 hours, so 2 hours for both players with a 30-second increment starting from move 1. So lots of maneuvering and shuffling around. White not giving any space here. Eventually, black decides it is time to do something and goes for this maneuver, bishop to d7, allows the rook in. Eventually, the bishop has to come back to kick the rook out, and now a3. So maybe at this point, rook e8 was possibly a better try for black. For example, after, actually not rook e8, but rook b8 first to try and take over the b file. And the point here is that if white goes rook e1, now black can try rook to e8. If white takes on e8, we'll take with the bishop. And here the plan would be to try to move the king, go bishop f7, and go after these pawns on the diagonal. Now, black is not yet winning here. The engine definitely likes black, but it's not clear if it's decisive or not. But perhaps that would have been the best way to push and press in this position. Because instead we get a3, and now rook e1, rook e8, trade of rooks. Rook comes back to b1, and the problem for black is that this a pawn ends up being a target. Now black's idea is that she gets rook a4 and can win the c pawn, but it comes at the cost of the a pawn. And here Paehtz was trying to do something against this rook on a3. The rook is trapped, but the issue is black is using all of the resources to keep this rook trapped, and there's no way to really make progress anywhere else. So eventually we get d5, d4, and trades on c3. But at this point, Paehtz decides to trade the rooks off. Essentially a draw offer, as with the opposite color bishops. These endgames are always going to be very, very drawish. And of course, both sides go ahead and trade off a bunch of pawns. And yeah, this one was just immediately drawn, as neither player has anything they can really do here. So very, very interesting game. Paehtz definitely pressing there and with some chances, but not ultimately able to break through. Finally, we have the only decisive game of the round between Kosteniuk and Dzagnidze. This one started off as an open Sicilian Taimanov variation, where Kosteniuk goes for this line queen to d3. This one is quite trendy these days. Knight takes d4 was the response, and now a6, bishop e3, b5. White plays a4, definitely a thematic idea to challenge black on the queen side. b4 was played, knight a2, and at this point, Nana spends a lot of time and plays move knight f6. And the most logical move here would have been rook to b8, just defending the pawn, but black decides maybe she doesn't need to. So she goes knight f6, and Kosteniuk spends some time here and ends up taking this one as what else to do. Black is ready to go bishop d6, bishop e5, and so white does need to take this pawn. And here black spends more time and ends up going bishop to b7. Likely the critical move here was queen to b7 that both players were calculating, hitting the knight on b4 as well as the pawn on e4. But the shot knight takes a6 was probably what discouraged black from this position. This is what Kosteniuk mentioned after the game, that she was planning to play this one with the idea to give up two pieces for the rook, but get this massive pawns on the queen side. White can play b4, maybe queenside castles, and this position very, very complicated, but seems like white has the easier game as the pawns can just advance, and of course black is very, very behind in development. So after a long think, black doesn't go for this line, plays bishop b7 instead, but now white has picked up the pawn, knight to d3, queen takes c2 is play, winning back the pawn, but at the cost of lots of development here. So rook c1, queen b3, rook to c3. Kosteniuk is very, very accurate here. If queen a2, then knight to c1, and this queen is very likely getting trapped. Bishop to d3 is coming, followed by castles, and black's queen is in a lot of danger. So instead, black played the move bishop to b4, but now white trades on b4, queen b4, bishop to b5. She could have taken as well and invaded with the rook on c7, but this is good too. And we reach this endgame with the two bishops for white, but a very, very good version of the two bishops, because white also has a nice structure, control over the c-file, and a huge advantage in this endgame. So d6 is played, rook to c7, rook b8, rook c1, e5, bishop drops back. And Kosteniuk's technique here is very, very nice. At this point, black decides to break free with d5. Otherwise, rook to d1 would be coming, and it's just very hard for black to hold this position. So d5, white takes on e5, takes on e4, and now just simple play. Trades on f6, ruining black's structure, fe4, and white has picked up a pawn. So Dzagnidze here does try to defend bishop c8, bishop a6, but rook f5. Kosteniuk keeps everything under control. Rook to c6 now, forcing a trade of rooks. Rook b8, bishop drops back to b5. If black trades, and white can take with the rook, for example, and white is a pawn up and has all of the strategic advantages in the world. So just a decisive advantage here for white. Rook b6, rook c5, rook e6, bishop transfers over to this diagonal where it's very, very strong. And now b3, and here black actually just resigns because white has dual threats of rook takes a5 with two connected pass pawns on the queen side, a completely decisive advantage, or invading with rook to c7 and then picking up the f7 pawn, where black's kingside also starts to fall. So at this point, Nana had had enough and decided to resign the game. With that, Kosteniuk wins the only decisive game of the round and takes back her spot in the leaders, as now she joins three other players with 2 out of 3 going into the next round. So that brings us into tomorrow's round 4, where we've got a number of critical matchups once again. Kosteniuk is white against the young Alice Lee, Harika white against Irina Krush, Dzagnidze white against Anna Muzychuk, Zhongyi white against Anna Zatonskih, and we have Paehtz white against Mariya Muzychuk. Should be another very, very interesting round, folks. I hope you catch it, and I'll see you here for the recap afterwards. Until then, take care.